All right, so I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Michelle Pearson. I'm one of the TPS team teachers that works with TLD every year. And we have a whole team of us here that are deeply honored to have John Mclean with us this evening. And before we start, I wanted to welcome you to our Wednesday evening keynote. And we wanted to give you just a few reminders. And as you know, we've got Goose Chase going on. Please join in. You can join in all the way up to the end of the week. And we really want you to be able to participate, join in the conversation and reflection, and win one of the many prizes. There are some rock star ones in there. You can also participate in the conversations and earn lots of points in Hoover as well. In addition to all of these different sessions that are on the agenda, we've got lots of resources and posters from TLD, and these can all be accessed in the poster link under Hoover. So you can hop in there, click on posters in the agenda section. It'll take you right to all those resources. So many of our partners across the nation have shared many of the resources from the beginning of the week, but also things we're going to be talking about throughout Friday and after. We'd love for you to join in and take a look at those. We also would like you to answer a polling question if you've got ideas for using this presentation in the classroom. We'll share those. We actually have a wonderful opportunity to continue to have this conversation. And we encourage you to utilize the question and answer and the chat options that are in Hoover to interact with our speaker throughout tonight and throughout the presentation. And we will be monitoring that as well as the chat so that we can all enjoy not only the talk, but the conversation after. So it's my pleasure to introduce both our author, John Mclean, and Cheryl Hughes. Cheryl Hughes is one of our TPS teachers that has been working with us on projects in Montana for many years. She's a consortium member and is one of the coordinators of the Mclean project. John, our author who is with us tonight, is an award-winning author and journalist and has written 5 books, including information about fatal wildland fires. These books are staples of literature, and his latest book, Home Waters, has become a resounding success across the nation. And we're thrilled to have him be here tonight to really discuss this book, which has been presented with critical acclaim in 2021. As one of our reviewers said about the book, his Hemingway-esque prose is as clear as a mountain stream, flowing with a poetic cadence and lyrically describing the many splendid natural treasures to be found under the big sky. And this was mentioned by Publishers Weekly. We know, though, from reading Home Waters, it adds descriptions of beautiful characters and places to his father's credit, Norman's famous novella, A River Runs Through It. He adds on to that, but this chronicle stands alone as his, and stands alone as a true testament to what Montana is, what the river is, and what we have to think about now about the future. And that's really important, especially as we look at this family story that's a chronicle of more than 2 centuries over Montana's history. And before turning to books, John was for 30 years a reporter and a writer and editor for the Chicago Tribune. And most of that time, he was a diplomatic correspondent in Washington. So I know he's got a multitude of stories and still remains actively involved in lots of endeavors in his hometown. He was one of the Kissinger 14, and that was the group of media who regularly traveled with Secretary of State Henry Kissinger during the era of shuttle diplomacy. And he currently divides his time between Washington, D.C. and Georgetown and his family cabin up at Seeley Lake in Montana. He and his wife, Frances, have 2 adult children, Daniel, who's an author, an adventurer, and a chief of the science department at Robert Service High School. So he's a teacher as well in Anchorage, Alaska, and John Fitzroy, a public defender for the state of Maryland. Beyond that, John is a dedicated and committed community citizen that believes in our environment, in our rivers, and in our future collectively as we look to protect and honor the stories that have surrounded these rivers. And John has been gracious enough over the last 6 months to work with a cadre of teachers in Montana to take his book and his father's and explore them and implement these wonderful pieces of literature into the classroom in partnerships with local museums in a very special project, which has been sponsored by the Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources program. I'm deeply honored to have spent time with John. So is Cheryl and Laura and our team here, and we're pleased to have him tonight. I'm going to turn it over to Cheryl, who's going to guide our conversation, and also John, who's going to speak to us tonight about his book and his passion for what is so special about Montana and our nation. Cheryl and John, it's yours.
Sorry, I muted myself. John, as a good friend and a colleague over the years, John responded to me so overwhelmingly when I taught River Runs Through It 15 years ago, I think now, and he worked with my students directly, let them call long distance and interview him, and we began a long friendship that brings us to today. And I'm really happy to have John on board with TPS tonight. You can go ahead and start, John. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. And thank you, Michelle. It's a real pleasure to be here. I thank you for inviting me. I'm going to be talking about my book, of course, but my book is about a specific place in Montana that may not be as familiar as Cedar Lake, may not be on the tips of everyone's tongue and right at the forefront of their memory, the way it is with me. So I thought I would start out by describing and showing some of the places that are in home waters. Home waters for me, of course, is the Blackfoot River in northwestern Montana. That is the sense of place that I establish in home waters, that my father established before me, that his father before him established. It goes way back for us. So where is this odd little corner of the Northwest world? And what does it look like? This is Seeley Lake from just about in front of our cabin, looking at the sunrise. That's the Cottonwood Pass where the sun is coming right up. That's on the right, Hotel Point, which never had a hotel, but which is now a major campground, the Seeley Lake Campground. When we first started coming there in the 1920s, we being the family, I'm old, but I'm not that old. This pretty much belonged to us. It was opened up to settlement by people like us, by the Forest Service. And we don't own the land, we have a lease on the land there, a section of it that has lakefront openings to it. It has a nice little beach. And it's been a long struggle to hold on to that lease. We finally have some assurance going forward that will not be taken back and returned to public use, which is a very nice thing, but it has been a long struggle. We pay quite a bit of money to have that, but it isn't an excruciating amount the way it was looking to be at one point. The Seeley Lake is about 20 miles from the Blackfoot River. And the Blackfoot River is a fairly short river. It runs from Rogers Pass down through the Blackfoot Valley and empties into the Clark Fork at Missoula. It is a very scenic river. Outfitters in Missoula say the best fishing is on the Clark Fork because there's more water and more fish, but the Blackfoot has the scenery. As you can see here, it's really rather nice. These are seasonable shots in the early fall. This is the upper Blackfoot. The one before that was the lower Blackfoot nearer to Missoula. This is way up near Lincoln, if you know the area at all. The Highway 200 pretty much follows the route of the Blackfoot River, and there's a reason for that. It's an old trade route, It's an old Indian trail. It was for centuries and perhaps millennia the road to the buffalo for the Indian tribes that lived west of the Continental Divide. You know, they had a whole intricate run of trails and sub-trails and so on. The one that ran along the Blackfoot River was kind of an interstate highway, and they called it the road to the buffalo. That creature on the right is Blackfoot River rainbow that I caught in the Muchmore Hole, which is a very famous hole. That's not the fish that is talked about in the book, but it's not a bad one either. That's about a 20-inch rainbow. This is a map that puts everything in perspective. If you look in the west central part of it, northwest central part of it, you'll see Seeley Lake running down to the Blackfoot River, and then off to the left is Missoula. And you follow Missoula to the right along the Blackfoot. You see how the highway parallels the river and goes to Lincoln. And then it crosses, and there's a little town there called Wolf Creek, which is where my mother's family was from. So this is the bigger picture. If you look down in the lower corner on the left, you'll see what's part of this map. I'm very proud of this map. This is the end paper in Home Waters, both in the front and at the end. And I worked very hard to get the publisher to do this, and the publisher, my editor, was very willing to do it. We worked to make it look a little old-fashioned without being rinky-dink and honky-tonk. It's got a little old feel to it, but it also tells you everything that you need to know about the places in Home Waters. And the principal place in Home Waters, the center is the cabin, our cabin at Seeley Lake, and that's it on the right. When I was a boy, we would go there every summer and spend the summer there because my father was a teacher, as you can see on the left. That's him teaching at the University of Chicago. He's a very gifted teacher and had to be at the University of Chicago because it was a research institution, much more than it was a teacher's institution. It was more of a graduate school than a college. And he always made sure that he taught at least one course in the college because he liked students. And I think I picked that up from him. What Cheryl talked about interfacing with kids in her class. I just love doing it. I mean, they're so alive and bubbly, and they're going to go on, and some of them are really going to do stuff. That's great. But the cabin was our hook to Montana. Without that, we would never have gotten back the way we did. We still have the cabin. That's pretty much a contemporary picture of it. You can see the horrible metal roof on it that I'm going to get rid of sooner rather than later and go back to a cedar shake roof, which was the original. But those logs are now been up there for 100 years. Last August was the 100th anniversary of our lease. This is what it looks like if you were to stand in front of the cabin on the porch and look out at Seeley Lake. You would see this very nice lake, the same one you saw earlier, with the mountains in the background. The fish on the left is a gigantic cutthroat that I caught and killed, not on purpose. The killing was not on purpose. The catching was on purpose. Right here where you can see Seeley Lake. If you were down in the lower left quadrant and go out about 25 or 30 yards, that's where I hooked into this monster on a dry fly. And I have a long story in Home Waters about that. And it ends very sadly, it starts to end very sadly, because as you can see, the cutthroat is flopping around in the bottom of my canoe. And they're not supposed to do that. The cutthroat are generally docile and sweet, and they lie there and have their picture taken, and that's very nice. They know that you're going to release them and everything's going to be fine. And he didn't do that. He banged around, and I finally got the hook out of his mouth and put him back in the water, and he went down like a stone. He was dead on arrival. And I was just aghast at having murdered this creature. And I've killed a lot of fish. I mean, we didn't have catch and release when I was growing up, and we relied on fish as a source of protein. But I've switched over to catch and release, and there are very good reasons for it, to preserve the resource. And besides that, a fish like this doesn't eat very well. You know, if you want to eat a trout, 12 inches or less. And so I drove the canoe right back into the back and ran up to the cabin and called my wife, and I was almost in tears at having done that. The story doesn't end there. And I don't want to have a spoiler here for the book, but it ends on a positive note. There was a resurrection and a new life for the fish, thanks to the people of Seeley Lake. 1921, as I say, was the year that we started there. 5 generations of us have been there, and God knows how many generations of deer. They come around the cabin in the evening, and they're like pets. And you can sit in there, and for some reason, they're not bothered if you're in the cabin behind the screen. They don't mind that too much. I was actually outside when I took this photograph, but by then, this deer and 4 or 5 others in their band and I had become friends, so it was okay. The cabin has produced a lot of literature. All of these books, my 6, my dad's 2, were written or researched, or written and researched in part at the cabin at Seeley Lake. And without that cabin, I think it is probable that none of them would have been written. So that's quite a claim for one old, well-oiled log cabin to make. But I think it is a true claim. My dad retired at the age of 70 from the University of Chicago and began his literary career. That's true. I mean, he'd written a little of this and a little of that, and lots of letters and a couple of very short magazine pieces, but he'd written very little, despite trying his entire life. And he retired at age 70, and he started to write and wrote A River Runs Through It, and felt exalted by it. The reception was marvelous. And he turned then to Young Men on Fire, the story of the Man Gulch Fire of 1949 that took the lives of a smoke jumper crew. And he spent the rest of his very long life, he lived to 87, working on that and did not finish it. And it was left to my sister Jean and myself to decide even whether to publish it. And we turned it over to the University of Chicago Press, and it had a good life there with a very fine editor who did not rewrite it. There was a lot of rearranging to make it work, but it was the kind of thing my dad would have done had he carried on, and he didn't. I quit the Chicago Tribune in 1995. I was very young to have done that. I was 52. And I did it after 30 years there. I put in my 30. And I started to write my own books, starting with Fire on the Mountain. And I would spend 6-8 months at the cabin, which was the only way I could do that. Imagine if I'd had to get a motel or something like that. It just wouldn't have happened. My life would have been very, very different. And once again, the cabin played this vital role, not only in maintaining a link for the whole family, but in promoting a good deal of literature. And I've written parts of all the other books there since. Okay, the people in the book. The book is a chronicle. It does go back 200 years, but it mainly involves my family, the Mcleans, and my mother's family, which is also my family, the Burnses. And they were in 2 different places in Montana. On the left, you see old Missoula, just about the time when the Model Ts were coming out for the first time. So there are actual cars there. They had the lineup for the trolley that was new. And that was a very famous photograph in a picture book of Missoula. And nobody knew who the kids were until somebody said, I know who those kids are. That's the Mclean boys. That's Paul on the left and Norman on the right. And I know who took it. And so they traced the whole thing down and they proved it. And yes, indeed. That's my father and his brother in Missoula on a snowy street in 1910. My mother grew up in the town of Wolf Creek, which is in a little narrow canyon about 35 miles north of Helena. It was a railhead town. That's why it was invented. A lot of rail lines came together there to service the Dearborn River country mainly, where they had big sheep ranches and some cattle ranches. They would drive the cattle down Wolf Creek, which is the small creek in a narrow canyon. And they'd come down to Wolf Creek where you can't see it, but between the houses and the railroad on the right is a creek, and it's the Little Prickly Pear. And Wolf Creek ran into Little Prickly Pear. There's the railhead, and they would load them up. My maternal grandfather, John Henry Burns, had the store there. Here he is in the 1920s in his store, and he serviced mainly the big ranches in the Dearborn River country. That's where the bulk of his income came from. They would drive their stock down, and then they would load up a buckboard full of supplies from John Henry Burns. That store is very interesting. I spent a lot of time in the Virginia countryside, and for several decades, I've gone into a little store in Philmont, Virginia. And I said, I feel very much at home here. And I've talked to the owner, and we finally figured it out. His store in Philmont, Virginia, and my grandfather's store in Wolf Creek, Montana, were Sears Roebuck stores. You ordered the store from a catalog, and it arrived on a rail car. And this is exactly what it looked like. And the owner of the store in Virginia now is bringing it back. And he goes around to auctions and gets all this authentic stuff. And you can see it there, all the display cases and so on. And it looks like my grandfather's store. And of course, I gave him a copy of Home Waters, which has a photograph, this photograph in it. And we've become very cordial. My paternal grandfather was the Reverend John Norman Mclean. We share the name. And that is his church, which he built with the architect A.J. Gibson. A.J. Gibson's wife, Maud, was the one who took the photograph of the two boys on the street in Missoula. She's a very fine photographer. And the Reverend came to Missoula in 1915 and in 1910 and built the church later on. And he stayed there until the 1920s, went to Helena briefly as administrator for the synod of the Presbyterian Church in Montana and Wyoming, and then as quick as he could, came back and finished his life in Missoula. His son, my father, Norman Mclean, wrote A River Runs Through It, about the family life that they had there. That's a line from the book. It is the opening line of the book, a famous one. The photograph on the left is, once again, Seeley Lake from almost that same spot, which is my photo spot there. And again, sun coming up in a fog and looking very mysterious. The fisherman on the right is Jason Borger, casting for Brad Pitt for the movie Of a River Runs Through It. And that is a still of his casting that wasn't used. Everybody's pretty familiar with the poster one, where he's actually got the shadow cast going forward. And Borger and I have become pretty good friends. And I talked to him about it. I said, how did you cast like that, the shadow casting? I said, I tried it when I was a kid, I couldn't do it. He said, well, we worked on that and worked on it. And there's no manual for how to make a shadow cast. And the shadow cast, you basically twirl the fly over the water to convince the trout that there's a hatch on. They rise, you allow the fly to land, they gobble the fly, you catch your fish. And, you know, it's good to look at, but do it that way. But they figured out a way of doing it with 2 Galway casts. And if you know everything there is to know about fly casting, you understand what I just said. A Galway cast actually is a backward cast. You turn around, you cast to the back, then you turn around to the front and bring it forward. And if you do that and give it a twirl, you get the shadow cast from the movie of A River Runs Through It. Giving away secrets. This is Paul Davidson Mclean, my uncle, who is the primary character, the main character in A River Runs Through It. This is him fishing the Blackfoot on the left, and as a younger man with an absolutely enormous fish, maybe from the Clark Fork, until they blew out the dam that held at the confluence of the Blackfoot and the Clark Fork a few years ago in a Superfund cleanup. These fish couldn't get up from the Clark Fork to spawn in the Blackfoot. So you had basically a population there that was captured. And the fish in the Blackfoot were not as big as the fish in the Clark Fork. Now that they've gotten rid of the dam in the cleanup, the fish can go back to their traditional spawning grounds and you can get great big ones. And that's the story that begins and ends Home Waters. This enormous rainbow trout that I caught there. And I'm sure that if water imparted DNA, that fish would have Clark Fork DNA in him. He wasn't the kind of fish that we ever saw in the Blackfoot when I was growing up. There's Norman and Paul again. They were very close, very loving brothers. Norman was the dutiful one. Paul was the troubled one. That's the cliche. And there are reasons for cliches because they're based on some reality. This is Polly's Bitterroot yearbook quotation. Best blocker on the team, never failing to get his man. You can see from the scowl on his face, which is the Mclean scowl. We all have it from time to time. That he was a tough boy. And there are accounts of his football exploits and my father's in Home Waters in some detail. Paul was killed in Chicago, not in Montana, in a back alley. He was beaten to death. My dad goes into the death, which is without which A River Runs Through It also would not have been written. It was the whole cause of it, trying to reconcile himself to his brother's murder. And I'm not saying it's done with rose-colored glasses, it's not, but it's not done factually. I was a police reporter in Chicago for a long time. And I went back to Chicago from Washington for a final tour before I quit. And made it my business to find out what I could about Paul's murder. And I put the bare facts in Home Waters. Again, I'm not going to be a spoiler and go into it in any detail here. But it was important to me to do that because Paul has been a shadow person for me my entire life, still is. Without his murder, none of this would have happened. None of it. You know, my dad's two books, none of them would have been written. It had very, very different lives. Something else might have been written, and it might have been good, but it wouldn't have been like this. This is my beloved mother, Jessie. The one on the right is at the cabin. To cause a disturbance is to be happy. She was a highly capable administrator at the University of Chicago Hospital for many, many years and was honored upon retirement as such. But she knew how to run things, which was lucky because my dad left all the accounting and everything, all that sort of thing to her. And she did very well with it. She was a lovely person. Worked very hard, but knew people. She had an incredible gift with people. and a good person could trigger an emotional rush in her. It was almost unbelievable to experience. Very overpowering and wonderful. Great lady. This is my dad at in the cabin at the fireplace, where he often sat and presided over storytelling hours in the evening. But here he is, looking as he often did. He's off somewhere. He's not in that place. He's in it, but he's not of it. He's thinking of something, fishing trip with his brother, something with his father, something that's not there. On the right is the wood of the true cross, also known as the typewriter that was used to type A River Runs Through It. There are several typewriters that claim that one. This is an actual, honest to God one that did type an original manuscript of A River Runs Through It. It was owned by Bert Sullivan, who was the postmistress at Seeley Lake. Dad turned over his incredibly difficult to read handwriting. He did everything by hand, all his writing, to her, and she was able to translate it into a typewritten page. Here's his Bitterroot yearbook quote. He talked a lot. He wanted to be like his father. He wanted to be like his dad and stand in front of people and declaim. And he did. As a teacher, that is what he did. And he loved doing it, and he was really very good at it. This is him at Dartmouth. He had a distinguished career. He was editor-in-chief of the Jack-o'-lantern, which was a paid position. Paul, in his first year in college, went to the University of Montana because there wasn't enough money. And then my dad got this job as editor-in-chief of the Jack-o'-lantern. And I put his salary in the book. It was very substantial. And I think that's what allowed Paul then to join him at Dartmouth as a sophomore. Paul graduated from Dartmouth in 1928. There's a good story about that because he had to finish up with an algebra course at the University of Montana that was not his subject. But we lived in two worlds. Speaking of places, the University of Chicago, very austere place. As you can see, there's not a lot of fancy stuff going on in that classroom. University of Chicago is kind of on a medieval Gothic architecture, and these could be monkish rooms, a blackboard, a simple desk, and a great teacher. On the right is a different side of my father as a rifleman. This was taken actually for the NRA during the war as an advertisement, and he actually was a left-handed shooter, but they put it on the right side so that it wouldn't disturb the viewer. River Runs Through It has had an enormous number of effects. It has some real hardcore fans. A guy on the right is a friend of mine, a smoke jumper from West Yellowstone Base, who has had the final paragraph of A River Runs Through It tattooed on his belly. There it is. The book and the movie have changed the face of Montana, changed the face of fishing, some of it for the good. And I talk about that in the book, of how Blackfoot was brought back from very serious depredation. But today it is overused. And there are too many of these things. This is an early season boat where I think they're just running the river. Their river's running high. But it's just loaded with boats now. It's overfished, it's overused. The kind of serenity that I knew and could still find 25 years ago when I went back and started writing books is no more. There will be 100 rigs parked at one put-in. No river can stand that. The Blackfoot is not a big river. It's just being hammered to death. And I am taking some swings on this. Blackfoot Clearwater Stewardship Act is pending before Congress. It would reserve 80,000 acres in the headwaters of the Blackfoot that would guarantee that they would go on as spawning grounds. So if you're going to have all these people, you've got to have the fish spawn somewhere. Senator Daines has held this up forever. He's continuing to hold it up. It's shameful what he's doing. We would make him a hero for Montana if he would turn around on it. There is still time, and I hope he does. But right now, he has a lousy record on this, and a very unpopular one. The Blackfoot Clearwater Stewardship Act has 76% to 79% approval ratings year after year in Montana. His alternate, which was to release 300,000 acres of wilderness study away from wilderness study and possible commercial use, got 8%. It's not popular. He's got to do a little better as a Montana senator. When I published Home Waters a year ago, I was hoping that it would have the effect of giving people a break in troubled times and make them feel good. That's what I was looking for. And it has done that, as you can tell from that quote from Facebook. They buoy the spirit during these unsettling times. But it has had a greater effect than that. And it has surprised and delighted me. And you can see through the teaching with primary sources and through the teacher programs in Montana, what's going on in a broader way, that it has enlivened the debate about conservation. And it has reached down to kids and teachers to come up with stuff from the book and develop it and come up with new things. On the left, you see the old road to the buffalo used by the indigenous peoples. I rediscovered a lot of that for myself, and it's in the book. But since the book came out, many more things have been rediscovered by people who were using the book as a starting point and going on from there and finding places where the trail existed and finding plants, places where Lewis might have gathered, made a botanical specimen gathering at one point down by the Clark Fork and the Blackfoot. And things like this are going on consequently to the book. And it's absolutely wonderful because I don't know what they're going to be, what they're going to be. It's creative, it's bubbly. There are young people involved in this. They're getting hooked. Not everyone. You don't hook every fish. You don't ever catch every fish that you hook. But some of them come in and can be wonderful. So that's been an overwhelming delight for me. And I've worked hard with the people who are doing this and will continue to do so. And that is the legacy of Home Waters. And I hope it is endlessly renewed by the passage of waters. Thank you.
Thank you, John. You know, I mentioned earlier that John and I became acquainted as he helped me bring the story of A River Runs Through It into my sophomore classroom at Sentinel High School in Missoula, Montana. And as you can all imagine, it's fodder for every class that's taught in a Montana high school, that book. But one of the things I want to explore with John today is we know the effect that A River Runs Through It had on Montana, both good and bad. Can you share a little bit with us about why you decided to write Home Waters and how you might reflect upon its effect as it pertains to river, and just some specifics about what you hope to do with your legacy of Home Waters?
Well, I didn't start out to write what became Home Waters, a chronicle of family and a river. I started out and wrote a fish story. I was fishing with a friend of mine on the Muchmore Hole, which is one hole on the Blackfoot that is for sure identifiable as being described in A River Runs Through It. The sandbar, the falls, the whirlpool, and the big fish, it's all there. Mm-hmm. And my own memories of my dad talking about it parallel that and confirm it. And this friend of mine was a businessman in Chicago. And he and his wife read a river runs through it, fell in love with it, and drove out to Montana when he was just a little bitty businessman. And they decided that they wanted to have a place out there, but they didn't have any money for it. They found a ranch, but it was far too dear. He went back to Chicago and worked, and he and a partner bought a phosphate company and built it up and eventually sold it. And he went back to Montana and bought the ranch. And then he could invite me to come fish on the Muchmore hole, which I did. And eventually, I mean, after many years, I went down there one day with him. It was a lousy day for fishing. Bright sunshine, but, you know, glittering on the water, you know, it would be terrible. We're not going to do anything. And I flipped a fly up at the head of the hole, and blammo, this monster came out of the deep, and I caught him. And it took a lot of doing. I just gave away the whole book. Oh, well. And my friend said, why don't you write that story for my Chicago Angler group? And I said, all right. So I wrote a little piece, you know, for a newsletter. And a friend of mine read that and said, why don't you write that story? That's a great Montana story. Why don't you write that for Big Sky magazine? So I said, all right. And so I did, and forgot about it. And a couple of years later, an editor from HarperCollins was on vacation in Montana and picked up an old tattered copy of Big Sky magazine and read the story. And he called me up and he said, would you like to do a book on this? I was in the middle of doing a fire book, a wildland fire book, and I said, I don't know, the book wasn't going very well, the fire book, and it was a lot of trouble, and I have since stopped doing it. And I said, yeah, let me think about this. So then I started pulling things together and discovered that I'd been writing this story for 30 years. After my dad became famous, he got old. I mean, it happens to all of us. And he would be asked to come and speak somewhere and would not be able to do it, or it would be uncomfortable to do. And I was back in Chicago and I'd go do it for him. And what I discovered is that people wanted you to talk a little bit, and what they wanted to know was, what was it like to fish with Norman Mclean? So I started writing that, and then I expanded it a little, and I'd rewrite it and play around with it and have some fun with it. And as I said, I was also, for my own purposes, trying to find out about Paul, my Uncle Paul's death. And there were other things. People began to die from my father's generation. And by chance, I was in Montana for several of those important deaths. I was asked to give eulogies and did. And so you get the idea here. I began to have a great big file of stuff that was relevant to a family memoir. So I didn't begin Home Waters just, you know, from the first paragraph and then right through to the end, and it's all new at all. But there are new things in there. The Road to the Buffalo, for example, I kind of knew about it. We'd all read Lewis's journals for his trip through the Blackfoot Valley in 1806 on the return journey. And there isn't much there, not much happened. But then I began to explore it and discover that there's a lot that's very interesting about that. And I think if I had that to do again, I would look at it carefully, because it's in the book, it's a very long section. But I'm not unhappy to have done it. There were real reasons for doing it. And as I say, it has ignited this whole new round of interest at Travelers Rest State Park. They're picked up on it. And individuals have picked up on it, and they're coming up with stuff. So that was new to me. There's a story in there about the first time my dad ever took me fishing when I was just a little boy. And I had tried to write that story for 25 years. When I first started going back to Montana and writing books, I would go to the place where that happened, because it was one of the most wonderful days of my life, one of the happiest. And then I would go back to the cabin and sit down and say, oh, I'm going to write this because I'm a writer. And I'd look at it the next morning and I'd say, that's really bad. I'm not on top of this. It's just too important to me. And when I was writing Home Waters, I got to the point in the book where that was what needed to be done, was to write that story.
Mm-hmm.
And I sat down and I wrote it.
Got it done.
And to me, frankly, it's my favorite part of the book, but that's just on a personal level.
Yeah.
So there was new and old all mixed together. And as the project went on, I realize I'm going on too long, but as the project went on, it changed character from being a fish story. Just as now it has changed character from being John's chronicle about his family to a call to arms for conservation of rivers, which is what I hope it becomes. That was the last part of your question. So that's it for me, Cheryl. I mean, as I said, I've dropped this other book project. I don't have a book project right now. This is my project. And we'll see where it goes.
Well, and so what you're saying basically is you feel like this has given you a stepping off point to carry the river book forward, certainly, but even more importantly, the reflection of the river book through your book, Home Waters. And then, you know, John, one of the things that, of course, we address with teaching primary sources is primary source documents and what is offered at the Library of Congress. Let's say that you decide you're going to be writing some reflective pieces. Would you certainly get on that metro and hop down to the Library of Congress and take a look at some of these maps? I know you felt like the end papers for your book were such a coup. And then, you know, as we begin to reflect on what happened on those lands, we're finding even more important things that happened, you know, as Kim Brigham, our journalist friend, is working on these things, and the various explorers from our Home Waters project. We're finding all kinds of ways to take the primary source documents that were originally used to create these books. And I'm kind of wondering if you see yourself moving forward in some ways with that kind of research. And, you know, as we talked about before we started taping, even as a witness before Congress in talking about some of these environmental acts.
A lot of the stuff in fire is new. When I first started writing about fire, I thought it'd be wonderful to live in Washington, D.C. because of the Library of Congress was there. And that I could get a lot of information there. And that proved to be a false trail. The Library of Congress was useful, but not in the way that I thought it would be. It did not have very much on fire. When I finally found the primary source of fire reports, it turned out to be a movable feast. It was at Marin Island at a federal installation. These are all the old original fire reports. Some of them are quite beautiful. There's a collection at Yellowstone National Park that I've been through of the fires during the time the military ran Yellowstone National Park. And when they're making a fire report, they will draw little horses because they were cavalry, and then their little tents are there and they draw those, and they will illustrate these things. Not so much with the formal fire reports, but that is now all online, all those fire reports. I copied lots of them, and I had an enormous amount of help with that. And it is a primary source. But what has happened is so much stuff has migrated to the internet that actually going to the Library of Congress doesn't have the pull that it used to. What I did do that was very useful was go to the folk music section of the Library of Congress for Fire on the Mountain, because there's an old party song, Fire on the Mountain, Run Boys Run. And I wanted to get verses to that were apropos of my story. And they have a wonderful folklore section there, and I spent days there because I enjoyed it so much. You can listen to the music and so on, and finally got the verse that I wanted and put it in the book. you would think that the Library of Congress would be a great source there. But frankly, I think you were the one who used it for this book more than I did by getting into Gifford Pinchot's papers. If I was to go forward, if I was a younger man, had more time and so on, I would dig into his files more. What you got, Cheryl, was this typescript of a journal that he kept when he went through the Swan Valley and passed by Seeley Lake before he became first chief of the United States Forest Service. That's who we're talking about, Gifford Pinchot. And it's in the book, and it made a wonderful addition to the book. And I had known about it. I don't think anybody was too much onto that. Pinchot mentions this trip briefly in his autobiography, but he doesn't go into any of the very interesting and exciting detail on that trip. And it's in the Library of Congress. I think you found it at his residence in Pennsylvania.
That's right. Yeah, his estate. That's right, at Great Towers. And that's what triggered me. You know, when I went to the Library of Congress following that visit, I was there just a few days later in Washington, and I had spent a week at Great Towers, and I went into the collection there, and there are thousands and thousands of documents because the Library of Congress, of course, has all of Pinchot stuff. And so it's a great treasure trove for any of us that are into public lands. And
I talked about how much is in there at the Library of Congress, and I hope that, I haven't heard, but I hope that somebody picks up on that.
I hope so too.
And gets in there and sees what you can find and relates it to Montana, because he had an awful lot to do with Montana. The forest reserves that he was scouting when he made that trip on his own nickel. He was came from a very wealthy family, and he couldn't get authorization from the government to do it. So he went and had this great trip. He said it was the best trip of his life through the Swan Valley. Then when it came time for him and Teddy Roosevelt to roll out the maps on the rug at the White House and decide what was going to be saved and what wasn't, he knew
executive decisions
what to save. And so all that stuff that we still have there up the sides of the mountains in the Swan Valley and also down in the Clearwater Valley, that is, thank you, Gifford Pinchot, and thank you for that trip. He came out at Ovando, I think, in the end, and picked up a stagecoach at Ovando.
Well, and they were out there fighting grizzly bears, and he was keeping handwritten notes like your father there in the Swan. I had a tough time reading his notes, and he always had a commentary at the bottom for his deceased fiance. And that's a really mysterious story, and I'll leave that up to you to do some checking on it, because it is a great story. You know, one of the things that I noticed, John, when I read your dad's book, and of course, because I know you so well, I know that this is true of you too. Your dad had an ultimate respect for artistry. And he talked a lot in his book about the art of various things in life.
And it wasn't restricted to art, what we think of as artists. It was
exactly.
Men in the woods with an axe can be an artist. And believed deeply in that and practiced it and had witnessed it and wrote about it. And I wish that, that kind of ethic had more currency these days when we seem to divide everybody up.
Well, and you talk a lot about different types of artistry when you talked, so much about the artistry, not only of, casting into the big Blackfoot, but how you treated the big Blackfoot. And you talked about the artistry of the Native Americans as they went on the road to the buffalo. And you talked about the artistry of building those incredible flies and the whole cadre of characters that are in the book that made their passion come alive with those flies that, of course, are so famous now. But I felt that you too had such and have such an ultimate respect for art in so many ways. One of the things, John, too, that I noticed your dad did was he had such a penchant for liking the tough guy, the guy that could stand up for what was right and wrong. And you know, of course I see some of that in you too. I'm wondering, you know, with takeaways from the Mclean legacy, how do you think that these two books can be best used by teachers to make certain that this writing and this view gets, you know, its maximum chance to exist in 20 years? You know, that's what I'm concerned about as a Montanan. And I know people in Colorado and people in New Mexico and people in Washington are as well. How do we take these novels and make them count with our kids?
I think that the life that we portray is an attractive one. People relate to that. That's why they describe these books as being beautiful, and why they say that some very strange people, I mean, kind of tough, straightforward people say, I love the book. You know, well, take that and say, can you still live this way?
Yeah, you can.
Can you still live this way? What do you have to do to live this way? What do you have to do as we have done, and pass this on, or try to pass it on to someone beyond yourself? Enjoy it yourself, absolutely. But what have you done to pass it on? Now, what has your passing done to make things better? And if you can use the books as inspiration for that, as well as enjoyment, I think that would be a wonderful thing.
I think this will be my last question for the evening. What surprised you the most about the reception of Home Waters? I've watched you come through this from the beginning to the end, and I'm curious what surprised you the most, and you know, what's your biggest victory so far in terms of public?
I've had a lot of surprises. When you take on A River Runs Through It, you've taken on a great deal. I was not scared. I had been scared when I first started, and I more or less took on Young Men on Fire. And that experience taught me a good deal, that there are going to be some people who don't like this. You can have Joe Valenti and Sons greengrocers and everybody applauds. But if you have Norman Mclean and his son John then picking up the writing torch, a lot of people just don't like it. They react very badly. Mm-hmm. But they're in a minority. And with Fire on the Mountain, my first book, I wanted to write a book that would be around as long as I was. And it's going to be that. It's good enough for that. Now, with River Runs Through It, that's different. I never started out to do what I did. And I think if I had thought about it at the beginning, I would have turned it down. I said, you just can't do that. A River Runs Through It is magic. It's one of the most beautiful books ever written.
I agree.
Who am I to do that? But then as I started writing this stuff, I realized, you know, I lived the same life. You know, I was there for a lot of this, and it's my life. I can talk about it. Mm-hmm. And I am inspired by A River Runs Through It sometimes, but I'm not sitting here doing what sons and daughters of famous writers have done in the past and being disgraceful. Mm-hmm. I mean, it happens over and over again. And you see this, where kids take after their parents in print, and their parents were famous or accomplished or something. I think that's utterly disgusting. Mm-hmm. And I decided at the outset that this isn't going to be some stinky little tell-all. I'm not going to tell dirty stories. Mm-hmm. This is going to be something that honors my parents, well, my mother as well as my father. And so that was on my mind as I worked through it. And then I got to the end of it, and I thought, yeah, okay, it's nice to have started with a fish story, pal, but you've written something that is going to be automatically compared to A River Runs Through It. Mm-hmm. And we'll see how this works out. And it has worked out. And that was what shocked me, frankly, from the first reviews through today, how positive the reviews have been. Nobody has taken off after me. You know, maybe somewhere somebody does. He said, why is he doing this? You know, he's just in his father's wake. Yes, well, I mean, he was my father, and I am his son.
Well, and it might be too, John.
Surprise. All right, that was surprise number one, and the conservation thing has been
exactly.
wonderful surprise number two, and it has this life now. The Blackfoot Clearwater Stewardship Act is one thing. There are going to be other things. I'm all for coming up with some sensible restrictions on use of the water. There's an outfitter in Missoula, an angler that has voluntarily restricted the number of boats that they're going to send out because they realize that they are killing the resource. They're killing the experience. You're not getting what we got. And you have to dial it back a little bit if you want people to come out and get some semblance of that. So this is going to be a long fight, and it's going to go well beyond me.
Well, and we know that it's going to happen in Montana, but it's happening in Colorado and New Mexico.
Any decent piece of water, and the pandemic has accelerated the whole thing and put it on steroids. I mean, the use of the Blackfoot has gone up 40% per year each year of the pandemic. 40% increases. It's unbelievable out there. I mean, when we were out there for one of the shoots, I was going to stick around and fish, and I just walked away because the boats kept coming in. I'm not going to fish on the Blackfoot. I'm driven off my own river.
Well, and too, John, I want to mention briefly before we wind this up that our Home Waters project that's affiliated with Metropolitan University, TPS in Denver, and they so graciously funded us so that we could team museum educators and a local educator in their communities across Montana to study these two books side by side. And then for each of those teams to come up with a project, we're going to present those in the footsteps of Norman Maclean Festival here in Missoula in late June. And we'd like to invite all of you and anyone who might have an interest to come and join us. John will be with us. We're going to present our dozen individual projects that we've created as a result of the Teaching Primary Sources grant that came through Metropolitan. But it's a great example of how you can take a couple of pieces of literature and bring the history and the place alive to kids of all ages. And of course, we'll be gathered together with some really influential authors as well. John's going to do the wrap up on Sunday afternoon, but it'll be quite a weekend here in Missoula, Montana. And I think that it could be something that would really tip its hat to Teaching Primary Sources and the Library of Congress and the kind of work that they can and should be doing to make our land better. So, and I know John's looking forward to coming and being a part of it. And I just want to thank you, John, for your years of sharing with me and my students, and then for sharing with these teachers tonight too. Does anybody have any questions for John? Michelle?
Oh, I have plenty, but I think we're going to open it up so that our participants can ask questions. John, thank you for that. And, I think that in looking at what you hope for your book, we hope that also through the sharing that we have tonight and the resources that we're going to be working with, we also can ensure that your literature, but this mission of understanding our rivers, protecting them, and looking towards the future is also shared with our students, because that's a big piece of all of this. So Laura has posted in that you're welcome to unmute and ask a question if you'd like. You can also post it in chat if you would. So I know everybody's hanging out. I'm sure there are some questions out there. And John, we won't keep you long, but does anybody have any questions that we can share with John and get his opinion or ideas on that? And then we'll go on after to share a few teaching resources and some other resources from the Library of Congress. So questions, and I know Kyle and Keith, you guys are taking a look at Hoover as well. If you're seeing a question that we don't, please let us know. We're gonna wait for a second and see if we've got any. I think everybody's digesting what's going on. I've got one question that has popped through, and John, here's one. What is your most memorable moment in writing your book, Home Waters? Is there something that is special to you in one of the chapters or the small stories? There's a teacher question.
Well, I suppose there are two points of view on that. One is what would be my favorite part of it as an author. And the other would be what is my favorite part of my life that is portrayed there. And I think that my favorite part of my life that's portrayed there probably is the final page of the book. And I leave that to you. As an author, my favorite part has been this response that has come in about conservation and the ability to actually do something about it. You know, it's so frustrating to write a book about dead firefighters and then have the same things happen again. And you know that people read it and they do improve their safety and so on. But, you know, I've written 5 books about kids being killed in fires and hoping that, you know, that the mistakes will be learned and it won't happen again. And then it does happen again. And I knew it would. And fire is dangerous stuff and it's going to go on happening. But with this book, to see that people's minds already have been changed about the whole question of restricting use on rivers. You get up and say, well, in Montana, and say, what we really need are more federal regulations. And you can get shot. I mean, it's not a popular position to take. And yet there are people who are hardcore Montanans that I've talked to and changed their minds. Said, yeah, well, maybe we have to start looking at doing something. And that's what happened with this Missoula outfitter. They're doing it on their own. That's Montana. You know, the federal government ain't gonna tell me what to do. No, good. I'm gonna do it on my own and do the right thing. That's Montana, doing the right thing on your own. And that has been an ongoing source of real joy.
Great. If somebody's not going to unmute, I have another one. What is your favorite primary source that is not a family document? I understand you like your end papers, but is there something else? There you go.
Okay, primary sources. Yeah, let me give you 2 very different ones. One, because it's going to give me time to think of the second one. One is the illustrations, the wood engravings as a primary source. My father's book, A River Runs, this is the one thing that I consciously did to imitate A River Runs Through It. In the first edition of A River Runs Through It, the little blue book, there are wood engravings and they're absolutely wonderful. By chance, as I was, before I got started on Home Waters, a guy called me up and said, I'm doing a study on the illustrations of A River Runs Through It. And I'd like to find the guy who did those because there are a lot of questions about them. There's one on the cover of the book that's of a cliff and a river. And I always said, where is that? You know, is it a real place? And questions like that. Mm-hmm. And so I ran the guy down. I found him. Speaking of primary sources, he was in his 80s. He was an illustrator for the University of Chicago Press, and he had retired and was living in Hyde Park. And I got his number and called him up and said, would you talk to this guy? And so he did. Then when we got to Home Waters, I was so in love with those wood engravings. I said, can we do the same thing? And my editor said, well, yeah. I said, you know, we're going to have to get somebody, an artist, we're going to have to pay him and all that kind of stuff. And it's not cheap. Yes, I've talked to my bosses and we're going to do it. So he found this wonderful guy, Wesley Bates. And we got to the end where we had all of them done and paid for except the final one. And the publisher ran out of money on the project. They put out, you know, they don't run out of money, but they put out so much for the project.
Yeah.
And so I said, all right, I'll pick it up. And so we got the last one in as well. And that was my happy primary source. Actually getting on the phone, finding this guy, acting like a reporter, which is what I really am. The other primary sources are the whole panoply of stuff that I got about my Uncle Paul's death. I don't know what I'm going to do with it. I've got some things. I didn't use everything I had, you know, but I had an awful lot, and I had collected it for over 30 years. And I wasn't going to do anything with it, to be honest with you. I had a big envelope full of stuff and sat in a drawer in my dresser. And I asked my wife one time, I said, I don't know what I should do with it. She said, burn it. And I didn't. And there it was. But it's all sorts of different primary sources. At one point, the Chicago Tribune, for which I worked for 30 years, was throwing out all its clippings because they were going to digital stuff. And they had microfilm of the stuff from earlier decades. So they didn't want to have all that paper stuff. So they said, you guys can take whatever you want. So I went and I got all the clippings about Paul Mclean. And I have those clippings, they're real. That's a primary source that is not available to anybody else unless they want to go back and look at all the microfilm, which you can do. So that was one. There were so many. Genealogy was fun. I have established a new sense of place. The Isle of Call in the Inner Hebrides in Scotland, which is where my family came from in 1821. Lachlan Maclean left there, and I had to find out all about that and find out about his past, why he left. There were family stories about that, and I never was able to completely nail it down. It was before the clearances, before they started kicking the sheep herders off the land and directing them to North America to get rid of them so that they could have bigger sheep holdings and make more money. That didn't happen until later. Then he got to Nova Scotia, and my grandfather went to an academy there, the Pictou Academy. And I started looking into it and how it was formed and how they taught. And I think that that's where the lead for A River Runs Through It came from. It was a Presbyterian school run by a Presbyterian minister who did not teach religion formally. He would teach it informally to individual students, but he taught science based on Scottish scientific teaching and taught it beautifully to such a degree that he had a natural history collection there that attracted John James Audubon as he was coming back from a trip to Labrador, and he stopped and looked at it. He said, God, you've got wonderful things here. I don't have this. I've never seen this before. And the guy took them out and gave them to him, gave him the samples. But they taught religion as a way of life, and they taught science. So suddenly you have these two worlds working together. And that's the lead of, in my family, there was no clear line between religion and fly fishing. The line is blurred. Religion isn't over here and everything else is somewhat separate. They're together. And I think that that's where that came from. And my grandfather taught it. He taught it to my father, who taught it to me. So that was a primary source that took a lot of digging into. I wound up reading Audubon's journals to find out what that trip had been like for him. And all the early stuff on the formation of the Pictou Academy. The academy is still there. And looking up the rolls of enrollment to find my grandfather with his name misspelled and then correctly spelled, things like that. So that kind of digging is possible because of the internet. Frankly, couldn't have done it without there. I couldn't have, done all the travel and so on. It was involved with that. But it does open up sources that were closed to you or not even thought of before. And that, I'm not going to pick one thing for primary sources. There were one after another came in. The places where Lewis had lunch and camped in the Blackfoot Valley led me to the guy in Butte, Montana, who is the world expert on that. And I started out by making a bad mistake and misreading a map that he had. And I called him on it. I wrote him a letter and I said, you got it wrong here. You put in it the first camping spot up near what is now the interstate highway. And I think it was down near the Clark Fork River. And he wrote back and he said, you've misread the map. Very nice letter. And he wound up giving me his hand-done tracings on a topographic map, so a whole series of them, where he believes Lewis went through the Blackfoot Valley. Now that's primary sources.
Yeah.
And he's gone out and hiked all that, and he had moved the site of that first camping spot because of a field trip that he and others took there many years before. So that kind of thing kept happening. It's just, wonderful stuff.
That's amazing. So I'm going to open it up and see. I've got one other question, but I want to see if anybody else wanted to come off mic or throw anything else in here. So has anybody else got another question? Otherwise, I've got one more that's come through in chat. Nope, everybody is enthralled listening. All right, so a question. How has Montana affected you and your family generationally? Do you think your children and grandchildren will carry on your passion for Montana and fishing and Seeley Lake as well?
They are connecting, not as closely as we did. And we spent all summer there every summer, and they can't do that. But my elder son went out to Montana and worked in Montana for several years, and then went to the University of Montana, graduated in geology, and went out and worked in eastern Montana in the oil fields for a number of years before he moved to Alaska. And he comes back and he has a lot of friends there. And in Anchorage, there's a cluster of former University of Montana grads. They follow the Grizzly games, some of them, but they also live next to each other. They remain good friends. The geology kids hang together. Somebody will have a job in South America and the mine closes, and so they come up and stay and hang in Anchorage for a while and like it and find a job there and cluster. Two of my nephews live in California, which isn't that far away. And they love the cabin, but they can't spend the kind of time there that we did. What I'm trying to do with them, with their cooperation and participation, is get the cabin in good enough shape so that it can be passed on to them and it will remain in family hands. There's a model, which is the Hemingway house in Ketchum. Mary Hemingway lived there for many years after Hemingway died. Mm-hmm. And when she died, she left it to the Nature Conservancy, who then left it to the Ketchum Community Library. And I did a gig for them just a few weeks back, talking about the role of Ernest Hemingway in A River Runs Through It and Home Waters, which is considerable, and also the books. And so now they take care of the house and have a writer's residency going on there. I'm going to go participate in that in September and spend a week there at Hemingway's old house. And if the kids can't handle it, that kind of thing might be a model to have some kind of collective ownership of it, so that the cabin continues on being the Mclean cabin in one form or another. But that's up to them. It's not up to me. But my job is to fix the place up enough so that that they're not inundated with some enormous bill for a new roof, or we put in new plumbing. We have a way to go. There's a long way to go on this, and it's expensive. Yeah. So my sister and I share that.
That's amazing. There's always a historic landmark option. Just saying.
Well, I've looked at that, and it has some drawbacks.
It does.
The National Historical Landmark, we could get that kind of a designation for it, and it may get that at some point. But you are then curtailed in what you can do to the place, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. And there are other obligations, including to the public. Mclean Cabin is not public, it's private. And it has never been, we don't rent it out or auction out a week at the cabin or anything like that. It's used by the family. It's also used by the Burns family. a cousin of mine and her husband love the place and have done an enormous amount of work on it very effectively. So it's still a family cabin.
Thanks, John. We appreciate it. And we appreciate your time tonight. We're going to take a few minutes at this lesson and really take the time and what you've worked with and move into some resources from the Library of Congress and share some of the wonderful things that we've collected with the Mclean project, including your CBS interview, the interview we did on the river with Montana Museum Association, and your podcasts and a few other things that we've been using in the Mclean project with our participants. So thank you very much. You're welcome to stay, but we also know how busy you are. And we also know that you're 2 hours beyond us on the East Coast side. So we thank you for taking your evening and being with us. I am
going to depart, but I thank you very much and look forward to working with you more in the future.
We do too, sir. And thank you kindly for that. And we'll talk to you soon. Thanks for being with us. Good Laura, night. I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you. Clear the slides. Let's go.
All right. So we do have some resources that we have collected as we worked with Mr. Mclean through the Home Waters Project. And we have a reading guide, and we'll share those with you as well. And we have a resources page, some different, you'll notice that on the resources page, we actually have a little thumbprint of the woodcuts that John was referencing, but the slide deck is here that we're going through, and some different study guides, resource lists, and some things for you to use in your classroom. We also have that same kind of a list and same resources, one-pagers for A River Runs Through It as well. We use that as a companion text, and it's just great to have these questions and to kind of guide your reading as you go through the books, some things to think about, different interviews and articles that help to just embellish and help you understand the books even more, and it just makes it a richer experience. And there is also a resource page with this book, and you'll notice another one of the woodcuts at the top, and you'll notice these throughout the books as you go through. But we just have lots of resources, videos, podcasts, things that you can use in your classroom that should help you with resources.
And our goal here was really to give you a broad base of foundational support in primary sources, but also contextual background. John is an exceptionally rich resource himself, and his talk tonight, you can tell, is just rich with not only family stories, but also the method of writing and how he came about these stories and how he implemented the process of really working with home waters. And so he has talked about this to lots of different people. As I mentioned early on in our presentation tonight, we were lucky enough to be able to film with John actually on the Blackfoot River and talk to him about these particular fishing holes, these special spots that were meaningful for him and his family. And Montana Museums Association and the radio and public TV associations in Missoula actually came out to film for us. And we have included that video so that you can watch it. He did a fantastic interview with CBS this morning and several podcasts. All of the inclusive pieces are in the one pager. I posted it in chat for you, but they're also included in the slide deck, which is at that link. But there are a multitude more, but these are probably 4 core ones. I'm starting with that top one. You'll really hear more about how he views the river and his thoughts about the book. And it's beautifully done. And it's a nice piece. You can actually take sections of it and share it with your students as a resource as you hopefully think about the possibility of sharing some of these resources, whether it be with the books or the primary sources themselves with your classrooms. So we hope that you'll consider that. So Laura?
There's another embedded video of a little bit of an evening like we've had with John tonight, but another occasion that he answered some questions. You'll get even more information from him and a better understanding of Home Waters and his work with that book. We wanted to give you an idea of something. We always like to leave you with a little bit of a technology, something that you can use with your classroom. We did a Jamboard activity with primary sources from Home Waters. And if you're not familiar with Jamboard, Jamboard is part of the Google Suite. It's a new tool. It's a whiteboard that you can add sticky notes or images, or you can use text. You can set the background. We have set the background here. These are primary sources. We've used a few. So Jamboard works like a little slide deck, and you can add some things. We added 3 primary sources here, and you'll see that we added some questions. So if you, and we'll put the link we just shared as well, but if you'd like to get in here and try this, when you come in, so there we go. So you just come over and grab a sticky note, and then you can choose what color you want. So in this case, we said, grab a blue sticky note from the left side, place it near something of interest, answer the question, what do you see? So it would just be a matter of, maybe you see a tent. It could be that much. And you can resize these and move them around. So it's really an interactive thing to do with your students, and a nice way to analyze primary sources. We like using the colors. Then, for example, take a green sticky note. What do you think you know about this image? So maybe, and please jump in if you'd like to. This looks like something to do with the Mcleans, right? Their names on it. So then again, you can just move that, resize that sticky note, move that around. So as we work with students and work with classes, we can quickly analyze a primary source and start to ask deeper questions, move into some sorting activities, really think about a question. But Jamboard allows you to move things around. We could put all the blue sticky notes on one side and then talk about these questions, talk about them with your partner, talk about them with groups. And we really have come to enjoy the Jamboard. And look at this image. What do you think you know? What questions do you have when you see this image? And you start to really drill down. Students were asking a lot of questions about what they were carrying, what's in their hand. You start to really notice those things. So we love Jamboard, and that's there if you'd like to try it. And we like this activity for analyzing primary sources.
So one thing I want to add to this that we really love is by working with these sources and being able to not only look at what they see, but also what students think they know, we're really developing that entire inference process and developing those inference and critical thinking skills. And if you don't recognize it already, it's the first 2 steps in the Library of Congress analysis sheet. And so we can actually continue on that process to work through the entire piece with the Jamboard. And I know we often get a lot of questions, because if you're not familiar in using Jamboard and you don't lock your background, your primary source can sometimes move around. There are really easy ways to ensure that your primary source stays in place. And that's with setting your background up. Laura, how many times have we started and we didn't lock the background and the primary sources moved? It's happened to all of us, right?
But once you set the background, it's there, and the kids can move the Post-it notes or move some of the things that they add, but they can't move the background. So it's set and ready to go.
Exactly. So we're at our time tonight. We're going to wrap it up with a couple announcements. Laura, thanks for walking through that. We've put the document here. It'll be same document is posted in the Mclean poster session, which is online in Hoover. So you can take a look at that. That's really important to remember. Hop in there. and take a look. We want to make sure that, we're in and out, and it will help you continue to stay apprised of everything that's going on. And we'd really like you to rate the session button as well. Click that button, just fill out a short survey. Let us know what you feel about the presentation. This helps us to grow and get better as we continue to work with TLD in the future. And we'll be sending out contact hours and forms and a survey from the Library of Congress at the very end of the week. And now I'm going to turn it over to Crystal, because she's going to give away a book pack. These are always some of our best prizes for attending in the evening. So Crystal, it's up to you to give that prize. And to wrap us up, we are looking forward to seeing you guys tomorrow at the Morning Mojo at 7:30 a.m. Mountain Time. For those of you who are across the country, we apologize for those of you who are west and a bit earlier. Crystal, it's yours.
Crystal said she was having problems with her internet. So,
so it's you.
So
all right, Keith.
Drum roll in your head. Our winner tonight for the book pack is Patricia Hutzel. Hopefully I'm saying that right. And Patricia, we have your information. Crystal will reach out to you and make arrangements to get that to you. But congratulations. And thanks to all of you, Michelle, Laura, Cheryl, John, who's already left. But thanks all of you for creating a very engaging and a bit of an oasis for all of us as we kind of think about place and such. So thanks to you, and thanks to everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
We appreciate it. Thanks, y'all.
Good night from Montana.
Thank you. Good night.
Yeah,
nice to see you.
Go visit a river and
Thanks,
enjoy.
everybody. Let us know if you have any questions.